I am Clara, 34 years old, and I recently learned how fast vows turn into demands. My husband Richard stood at the foot of my bed and casually announced that this Saturday all 15 members of his extended family would be arriving to stay at our house for 2 weeks. I clutched my bleeding abdomen in absolute disbelief. I begged him to please postpone their visit until at least next weekend, reminding him that I had just undergone a major invasive surgery. He stared at me with eyes so cold they sent a shiver down my spine and said, "No one is waiting." He ordered me to do as he says and stop making everything about myself. If you have ever been trampled by the person who promised to cherish you when you were at your absolute most vulnerable, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. You will want to stick around to hear how I legally threw all 16 of them out into the street with absolutely nothing. My physical reality at that moment was a living nightmare. Just 3 days prior, I had undergone a highly complex myomectomy to remove several exceptionally large fibroid tumors from my uterus. As the founder and chief executive officer of a successful digital design agency, I was used to pushing through pain, stress, and impossibly long hours. But this medical situation was entirely different. The procedure was incredibly invasive, leaving me with a deep horizontal incision across my lower abdomen. My doctor had been exceptionally strict with my discharge instructions before sending me home. She warned me repeatedly and firmly about the severe risks of internal hemorrhage, life-threatening infection, and the very real danger of tearing my fresh internal stitches. I was placed on absolute uncompromising bed rest. I was not allowed to lift anything heavier than a simple glass of water, and I was strictly forbidden from navigating the stairs under any circumstances. Every single time I coughed, took a deep breath, or even slightly shifted my weight on the mattress, a searing, blinding agony ripped across my core. I was relying heavily on a strict schedule of prescription pain medication just to tolerate existing. My body was desperately trying to knit itself back together from the sheer physical trauma of being sliced open. All I needed was absolute quiet safety and uninterrupted rest. Instead, I was trapped in my master bedroom, wearing a loose surgical gown and trembling from the low-grade fever that frequently accompanies major post-operative recovery. I had purchased this beautiful minimalist home completely on my own before Richard and I even got married, using the hard-earned profits from my agency. It was designed to be my quiet sanctuary. Now the peace of my home felt entirely threatened. Richard did not care about my medical fragility. He paced back and forth across my bedroom floor, aggressively checking his expensive watch. He completely ignored my pain, focusing exclusively on his family and their impending arrival. His mother Patricia, his father George, his demanding sister Rachel, and a whole flock of loud, unruly children and distant relatives were currently making their way to my doorstep. When I cried out and asked how I was supposed to host 15 people when I could barely walk to the bathroom, the psychological manipulation began. He rolled his eyes, sighing loudly as if my bleeding wounds were a personal insult to his weekend plans. He told me I was being overly dramatic and lazy. He labeled my valid doctor-verified medical concerns as selfish complaints designed to ruin his family reunion. He stood over my bed, pointing a finger at me, and declared that a good wife would be honored to host her in-laws. He insisted that the surgery was just a minor issue, and that I was milking the recovery for sympathy. The absolute cruelty in his voice took my breath away. He was furious that I was ruining his chance to play the wealthy, successful host for his relatives. Richard loved the prestige of living in my expensive house, and he frequently used my wealth to show off to his family, pretending he was the primary provider. Now my physical inability to serve his parents was putting a dent in his grand illusion. He demanded I stop whining, clean myself up, and prepare the guest rooms immediately, completely disregarding the fact that doing so could send me straight back to the emergency room with a ruptured incision. Before I could even process the sheer magnitude of his betrayal, the storm officially hit our driveway. I heard the crunch of gravel outside my window, followed by the heavy slamming of multiple car doors. 4 vehicles had just pulled onto the property. The high-pitched, chaotic screaming of Rachel's children pierced the quiet walls of my house. I clutched my abdomen, my knuckles turning white as I braced for the impending disaster. The heavy oak front door burst open with a violent thud that shook the floorboards beneath me. A chorus of loud, demanding voices flooded the downstairs hallway. I could hear Patricia immediately barking orders about where to place her luggage, complaining loudly about the temperature of the house, and asking why there was no elaborate lunch waiting for them upon their arrival. The booming laughter of George and the chaotic stampede of small feet echoed up the staircase. Richard smiled brightly, his entire demeanor changing from the cruel tyrant he was just seconds ago into the eager, welcoming son. He turned his back on me without a single word of comfort, completely indifferent to the tears of frustration sliding down my cheeks. He practically jogged out of the room to greet his family, leaving me trapped in my bed, bleeding feverish and utterly terrified of what this invasion would mean for my physical safety and my sanity. The nightmare had just begun. The heavy thud of suitcases echoing up the custom glass staircase signaled the immediate terrifying invasion. I could easily hear Rachel's shrill voice echoing directly from the foyer. At 32, Richard's younger sister still operated under the absolute delusion that the world was her personal playground. She unleashed her 4 deeply undisciplined children the exact moment she crossed the threshold. My house, painstakingly curated with minimalist high-end Italian furniture and delicate glass fixtures, instantly became their personal gymnasium. The sharp sound of muddy sneakers racing across my imported white oak floors made my chest tighten with anxiety. I heard a loud, violent crash from the formal living room, followed immediately by the unmistakable sound of breaking ceramics. It was likely my custom geometric vase, an expensive piece I had commissioned from a local artist. Rachel did not even bother to scold them for the destruction. Instead, she laughed loudly, telling Richard that boys will be boys and demanding to know where they were supposed to dump their wet winter coats. The sheer volume of 15 people occupying my carefully designed sanctuary was entirely suffocating. Cousins, aunts, and uncles aggressively dragged their heavy suitcases against the hallway walls, carelessly scraping the fresh paint. They treated my home like a cheap roadside motel. The physical vibrations of them stomping around downstairs actually reverberated up the walls and straight into my mattress, sending sharp, terrifying spikes of pain directly into my fresh surgical wounds. I tried to sit up to lock my bedroom door, but the agonizing pull in my abdomen forced me back down against the pillows. I was completely defenseless against the chaos unfolding just feet away. The noise reached a new piercing pitch when Patricia and George finally made their grand entrance. My mother-in-law, Patricia, at 60 years old, possessed a voice that could curdle milk. She immediately began her usual routine of aggressive, unfounded criticism. I heard her loudly complaining about the modern aesthetic of my home. She called my expensive, clean-lined decor utterly soulless and sterile, demanding to know why Richard allowed his wife to waste his hard-earned money on such absolute garbage. She had absolutely no idea that my agency money bought every single item in this house. George, at 65, simply grunted his agreement forever, the spineless enabler of his wife's toxic behavior. Then heavy, deliberate footsteps approached the stairs. Patricia did not bother knocking. She shoved my bedroom door open so hard the handle slammed violently against the drywall. She stood in the doorway, taking in the sight of me lying in my surgical gown, pale, feverish, and sweating. There was zero sympathy in her cold, calculating eyes. Instead, she crossed her arms and sneered. She loudly announced that she could not believe my sheer laziness. According to Patricia, laying in bed at 2 in the afternoon while guests arrived was a massive insult to traditional family values. She demanded to know why the guest beds lacked extra down comforters and why the kitchen was completely unstocked. I took a shallow, painful breath and reminded her about my myomectomy. I explained that my doctor strictly ordered me to remain immobile to prevent internal bleeding. Patricia rolled her eyes, completely dismissing my medical reality. She scoffed, telling me that women in her generation gave birth in fields and went right back to work. The toxic family dynamic was suddenly on full display, designed entirely to humiliate and break me down. I looked past Patricia, hoping desperately to see my husband stepping forward to defend me against her baseless verbal attacks. Richard finally appeared in the doorway, holding two heavy suitcases belonging to his father. Instead of protecting his bleeding wife, he happily joined right in with his mother. He let out a loud theatrical sigh and shook his head in mock disappointment at my condition. He looked directly at Patricia and proclaimed loudly that my surgery was just a minor inconvenience. He told his gathered family that I was simply using a basic routine outpatient procedure as a pathetic, calculated excuse to avoid my hosting duties. The absolute betrayal sliced deeper than the surgical scalpel that had cut into my stomach just days prior. My own husband, the man who had sat in the surgical waiting room and personally heard the chief surgeon detail the severe risks of my recovery, was now publicly reducing my physical agony to a manipulative tantrum. He actively encouraged his mother's cruelty to elevate his own status as the long-suffering husband dealing with a dramatic, incredibly lazy wife. He smugly told Patricia to simply ignore my bad attitude and promised her he would personally handle absolutely everything to ensure her comfort. The destruction of my peace was absolute. My bedroom door remained wide open, inviting the deafening roar of the house directly into my personal space. Rachel's children were now screaming at the top of their lungs, demanding food and entertainment from a kitchen they had already ransacked. They were jumping wildly on the expensive velvet sofas in the formal living room, their shrill, demanding voices cutting right through my skull like a rusted blade. Below me, multiple oversized televisions were turned on to maximum volume, blasting different loud sports channels and obnoxious cartoons simultaneously. Several relatives began shouting up the stairs, demanding to know what time dinner would be served, and complaining loudly about being starving from their long road trip. I lay there in blinding physical agony, clutching my trembling stomach, completely ignored by the 15 people who had just ruthlessly commandeered my life. My carefully protected sanctuary was violently shattered into a million jagged pieces. The walls seemed to vibrate with their toxic, entitled energy. Not a single person offered me a simple glass of water. No one bothered to ask about my pain. I was nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle in their newly claimed territory, a ghost haunting my own home while they celebrated their arrival. My physical torment was completely invisible to them. Barely an hour had passed since their chaotic arrival when the heavy oak door to my master suite swung open again. Richard marched inside, carrying 3 empty cardboard boxes flattened under his arm. He dropped them violently onto my pristine velvet chaise lounge. He stood at the foot of my bed, his arms crossed defensively over his chest. He did not ask how I was feeling or if I needed water. Instead, he coldly demanded that I get up and start packing my personal items immediately. I stared at him through a haze of fever and searing abdominal pain, asking what he meant. He casually announced that his mother required my custom orthopedic mattress. According to Richard, Patricia had a bad back from the long car ride and simply could not be expected to sleep on a standard guest bed. He declared that I was vacating the master suite immediately to accommodate her needs. I gasped, clutching my fresh surgical wounds, and reminded him that my doctor explicitly mandated I remain flat on my back in a sterile environment. I told him moving was physically dangerous and could tear my internal stitches. Richard aggressively scoffed, completely devoid of empathy. He leaned over my trembling body, his voice dropping to a harsh, menacing whisper. He told me I was being incredibly selfish. He accused me of disrespecting the woman who gave him life. He pointed toward the door and ordered me to pack my things and relocate to the basement guest room immediately. He insisted that the basement was quiet and perfect for my supposedly exaggerated recovery needs. The absolute cruelty of his demand left me temporarily speechless. He was forcibly evicting his bleeding wife from her own bed to appease his demanding mother. I had no choice but to comply. The sheer hostility in my husband's eyes made it abundantly clear that fighting back would only result in him physically dragging me out. I slowly pushed the heavy duvet off my shivering body. Every tiny muscle movement required to sit up felt like a serrated knife dragging across my lower abdomen. I bit my lips so hard, I tasted metallic blood, desperately trying to stifle a scream of pure agony. I clutched a decorative throw pillow tightly against my stomach, creating a makeshift splint to physically hold my internal organs in place. I slowly swung my legs over the edge of the mattress. My vision went completely black for a terrifying second as a wave of intense nausea washed over me. I stood up on trembling legs, leaning heavily against the wall for support. Richard did not offer a single ounce of physical assistance. He simply watched me struggle impatiently, tapping his foot against the hardwood floor. I shuffled out of my bedroom past Patricia, who was already directing her husband to carry her heavy suitcases into my newly vacated sanctuary. The journey to the basement door took everything out of me. When I reached the top of the steep wooden staircase leading down into the dark lower level, panic gripped my throat. My doctor had explicitly warned me that navigating stairs could trigger a massive internal hemorrhage. I grabbed the wooden handrail with sweaty palms. I took the first step down, leading with my right foot. A searing, blinding flash of white-hot pain ripped through my surgical incision. I gasped loudly, tears of pure physical torment streaming down my face. I took the next step, feeling a warm, terrifying dampness spreading across my surgical dressing. My stitches were violently pulling apart under the extreme physical strain. I paused on the fourth step, completely paralyzed by the excruciating pain radiating from my core. I leaned my forehead against the cold wall, praying for the dizziness to pass. Suddenly, the basement door above me was yanked open again. Richard stood at the top of the steep staircase, blocking the light from the hallway. He glared down at my trembling, bleeding form with absolute disgust. He loudly yelled at me to hurry up and stop putting on a pathetic, dramatic performance. He aggressively complained that Rachel was waiting in the hallway and urgently needed to move her excessive amount of luggage into the adjacent guest room. He told me I was entirely in the way and deliberately holding up his family vacation schedule. His voice echoed harshly in the narrow stairwell, completely devoid of any basic human compassion. He did not care that his wife was actively bleeding through her surgical gown. He only cared about appeasing his entitled sister. He clapped his hands loudly, demanding I pick up the pace and get out of sight. The sheer humiliation of being screamed at like a disobedient child while physically suffering pushed me to take another agonizing step downward. I finally reached the concrete floor of the basement, my entire body soaked in cold sweat. I dragged my battered frame toward the tiny windowless guest room next to the massive roaring heating unit. The air down here was incredibly damp, freezing, and smelled faintly of wet dust. I pushed open the flimsy door and collapsed violently onto the cheap, thin mattress that had not been used in years. My body practically gave out the exact moment I hit the stiff springs. I curled into a tight, trembling ball, clutching my stomach in the darkness. Directly above my head, the heavy, triumphant footsteps of my visiting relatives marched gleefully across the main floor. I could clearly hear Patricia loudly celebrating her successful hostile takeover of my luxurious master suite. The massive mechanical roar of the unit beside my head vibrated straight into my skull, masking the sound of my weeping. I lay there in absolute agony, banished to the cold depths of the house I had entirely paid for realizing just how little my existence mattered to the man I blindly married, and quietly planning exactly how I would make him pay for this. Day 2 of my imprisonment began before the sun even managed to pierce the narrow, dirty window high up on the basement wall. I had not slept a single minute. The noise from the upper levels was completely deafening, rolling like relentless thunder across the floorboards directly above my head. Heavy footsteps pounded aggressively against the ceiling, shaking the cheap light fixture dangling in the center of the dark room. The television in the basement entertainment area on the other side of my thin wall had been turned on at maximum volume before 6 in the morning, blasting chaotic cartoon sound effects right into my fragile sanctuary. I lay perfectly still on the sagging mattress, staring up into the oppressive gloom. A dangerous heat began radiating from my skin. My temperature was steadily rising, the unmistakable chills of a post-operative fever settling deep into my bones. My surgical dressing was soaked with sweat and fresh blood from the terrifying descent the night before, and the localized pain had transformed into a massive radiating burn across my entire abdomen. Every vibration from the floorboard sent shockwaves of agony through my battered core. I squeezed my eyes shut, silently willing the fever to break, but the relentless chaos above only amplified my physical suffering. The sheer disrespect of their existence in my space was suffocating. They were actively treating my beautiful home like an amusement park, entirely indifferent to the fact that the actual owner was bleeding in the dark, right beneath their feet. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the relentless thumping, a sound that made my blood freeze instantly. It came from directly above the guest room, exactly where my private home office was located. The heavy solid wood door of my user experience and user interface design studio was supposed to be securely locked. I had explicitly told Richard to keep everyone out of that room. It housed over $50,000 worth of specialized tech equipment, highly sensitive client files, and the primary server for my entire agency. I heard the unmistakable rattling of the brass door handle, followed by the violent thud of a heavy object slamming against the wood. Rachel's deeply undisciplined children were using something heavy to aggressively batter their way inside. I tried to scream at them to stop, but my voice was completely lost over the roar of the massive furnace next to my bed. A sickening crack echoed through the house as the lock finally gave way. The door slammed violently open, hitting the drywall with a massive crash. The chaotic stampede of multiple children flooded directly into my pristine workspace. I held my breath in absolute terror. 10 seconds later, the nightmare materialized. I heard the sickening explosive sound of shattered glass and crunching plastic hitting the hardwood floor. My custom curved ultra-wide display monitors, the essential tools I used to build my entire business, had been violently shoved off the main desk. The heavy crash shook the ceiling directly above me. Panic completely overrode my agonizing physical pain. My hands violently trembled as I blindly felt around the thin, damp sheets for my smartphone. I desperately unlocked the screen, the harsh blue light blinding my feverish eyes in the dark basement. I immediately opened my text thread with Richard. I furiously typed a frantic message begging him to go upstairs right now and physically remove Rachel's children from my office. I pleaded with him to protect my livelihood explicitly, reminding him that my specialized equipment was the sole reason we could even afford this massive house and his luxurious lifestyle. I hit send and watched the small delivery icon appear. I waited in agonizing silence as the sound of smaller objects being violently thrown against the walls continued to echo from my studio above. A full 2 minutes passed before my screen finally illuminated with a new message notification. Richard's reply was chillingly dismissive and completely devoid of any basic human empathy. He did not offer to intervene or check on the massive damage. He simply texted me to stop being so ridiculously materialistic. He aggressively typed that they are just children playing and that I was completely overreacting to a few pieces of replaceable electronics. The sheer audacity of his response made me physically nauseous. He was happily allowing his sister's feral children to completely destroy my professional business equipment, minimizing my life's work as meaningless clutter just to avoid a minor confrontation with his entitled family. The heavy cruelty of my husband's betrayal was still ringing in my mind when a new form of psychological torture drifted down from the upper floor. The massive steel air vent located directly above my bed was directly connected to the main floor kitchen. Through the cold metal slats, Patricia's shrill, judgmental voice echoed with terrifying clarity. She was holding court with the rest of the family over an elaborate breakfast, completely unaware or entirely indifferent that the metal ductwork carried her toxic words straight down to my freezing cell. I lay motionless, forced to listen, as she loudly disparaged my complete inability to properly host her family. She aggressively complained to Rachel that my absence was a calculated insult to their rich family traditions. Then the conversation took a deeply sinister, unforgivable turn. Patricia leaned into the topic of my complex fibroid surgery. She weaponized my deeply personal medical trauma, completely twisting the narrative to attack my fundamental worth as a woman. She loudly declared to the kitchen that Richard deserved a vibrant, healthy wife, not someone completely broken and defective. She used that exact word, defective, letting it hang in the air like a venomous curse. She smugly asserted that my medical condition proved I was genetically inferior and entirely unfit to ever carry a child for her precious son. The room above erupted into cruel, agreeable murmurs. The absolute malice in her statement burned away my feverish haze, replacing my physical agony with a terrifying ice-cold clarity. I slowly balled my trembling hands into tight fists. They had pushed me out of my bed, destroyed my business, and now they were attempting to strip away my basic humanity. The venomous echoes from the air vent faded as a new aggressive agony took over. The absolute starvation was becoming completely unbearable. I had not consumed a single solid meal in well over 24 hours. My empty stomach clamped down violently upon itself, sending fresh, sickening waves of nausea rolling steadily through my entirely feverish system. My body desperately tried to heal my major surgical wound, rapidly burning through my remaining energy reserves. My blood sugar plummeted, making the dark concrete walls of the basement spin wildly around me. I was far too weak to physically stand, let alone navigate the steep, treacherous staircase to reach the kitchen. Knowing Richard would never bring me sustenance, I reached for my phone with trembling fingers. I opened a premium food delivery application, my blurry eyes straining against the bright screen. I desperately searched the menus for something highly nutritious, warm, and exceptionally easy to digest without causing further abdominal distress. I found a premium organic restaurant and quickly ordered a $50 restorative bone broth and pureed vegetable soup. The high delivery fee did not matter. It was a vital medical necessity. I meticulously typed explicit instructions in the delivery notes, begging the driver to leave the securely sealed bags directly on the front porch and immediately ring the doorbell. I curled back into a tight, shivering ball on the damp mattress, staring blankly at the digital clock on my phone screen, counting every single agonizing minute as I waited for the notification that my desperately needed nourishment had finally arrived. 45 agonizing minutes later, a bright green delivery confirmation banner flashed across my phone screen. A photograph of the brown paper bag sitting on my front porch accompanied the text. I let out a massive sigh of relief, my mouth watering instantly at the thought of the warm, healing broth. I lay perfectly still for another 10 minutes, eagerly waiting for the heavy footsteps of my husband coming down the stairs to deliver my food. I knew Richard was fully capable of retrieving it. The digital doorbell chime was incredibly loud and echoed clearly throughout the entire main floor. I waited another 5 minutes. Nothing happened. The basement door remained firmly shut. A deep, terrifying, sinking feeling settled heavily into my empty stomach. Summoning my absolute last reserves of physical energy, I rolled off the thin mattress and crashed hard onto my hands and knees. The freezing cold, unforgiving concrete floor sent a violent, agonizing shockwave radiating straight through my highly sensitive surgical incisions. I could not stand up. My legs simply refused to support my body weight. Taking a shallow breath, I began to crawl across the dirty floor toward the staircase. Every movement forcefully pulled at my fresh stitches. I gripped the bottom wooden stair with both hands and began the excruciatingly slow, humiliating climb. I dragged my heavy, bleeding body up one step at a time, crying silently in the dark. It took 15 minutes of pure physical torture to reach the top landing and push open the basement door. The bright afternoon sunlight temporarily blinded me as I weakly dragged myself out of the stairwell and onto the polished hardwood floor. I braced myself against the marble kitchen island, slowly pulling my trembling body upward until I could see over the countertop. The sight that greeted me made my blood run entirely cold. Sitting casually around my custom dining table were Richard, Rachel, and her destructive children. They were entirely engrossed in a massive feast. But it was not their food. In the center of the table was the brown paper bag from the organic restaurant. Rachel's youngest son carelessly dunked cheap white bread directly into my expensive, restorative bone broth, spilling liquid over the linen tablecloth. Richard was aggressively spooning the pureed vegetable soup into a bowl for himself, laughing loudly at a joke his sister had just made. The thick, rich scent of the warm broth filled the kitchen viciously, mocking my starving, depleted body. They had not simply ignored the delivery, they had actively intercepted it. Opened the securely sealed packaging with my name printed clearly on the receipt and decided to consume my medical recovery meal as a mid-afternoon snack. They looked completely relaxed, treating my expensive nourishment like a free appetizer. My husband casually ate the very fuel my broken body desperately required to survive. The sheer breathtaking entitlement on display completely shattered the final lingering illusion I held regarding his character. I stood there swaying heavily against the cold marble counter, my fingernails digging desperately into the stone to keep myself upright. I forced my raw throat to open and hoarsely demanded to know what they were doing with my food. The lively conversation at the table abruptly stopped. Rachel looked over at my pale, sweating face and visibly grimaced as if my bleeding presence was actively ruining her stolen meal. Richard slowly lowered his spoon, wiping his mouth with a napkin. He did not apologize. Instead, he let out a heavy sigh and rolled his eyes. He looked at me with absolute disdain and casually stated that the children were hungry and simply could not wait for Patricia to finish cooking dinner. He told me I was being dramatic over soup and explicitly ordered me to wait my turn. The staggering, unforgivable cruelty of his casually spoken words slammed directly into my chest like a physical blow. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a direct, calculated message. As I watched my husband happily feed my expensive medical sustenance to his ungrateful nephew, the final terrifying realization settled into my mind. They did not view my basic needs as secondary. They viewed my basic needs as entirely irrelevant. My pain, my starvation, and my sheer physical survival meant absolutely nothing to the man I had married. I stared directly into Richard's cold, dead eyes, no longer seeing a husband, but a dangerous predator happily starving his captive. Day 3 broke with a level of agony I did not know the human body could endure. The blinding pain from my surgical incisions had officially reached its absolute peak. My desperate crawl up the stairs the previous afternoon, and the severe lack of any real nutrition had taken a massive toll on my fragile system. I woke up shivering violently on the damp basement mattress, completely drenched in a cold sweat. It felt as though a serrated blade was actively twisting deep inside my lower abdomen with every shallow breath I took. The sharp burning sensation radiated down my legs and up into my chest, making it entirely impossible to find any comfortable position. I reached blindly in the dark for my phone to check the time. It was barely 7 in the morning. My strict medication schedule mandated that I take my heavy prescription painkillers every 6 hours to stay ahead of the severe post-operative trauma. But I had entirely missed my last 2 doses. In the chaotic, humiliating rush of being forcefully evicted from my own bedroom by Richard, my orange prescription bottles had been left sitting on the top shelf of the master bathroom medicine cabinet. I desperately needed those pills just to survive the next hour. My doctor had explicitly warned me that falling behind on pain management after a major myomectomy would trigger a massive neurological pain response, and she was absolutely right. The throbbing agony was entirely blinding. I curled my hands into tight fists, digging my fingernails into my palms to distract from the searing heat ripping through my core. I knew I had to get those pills. No one was going to bring them down to me. The realization was terrifying, but the physical pain was infinitely worse. I had to go back upstairs. The agonizing climb back up to the second floor required an almost superhuman level of mental dissociation. I dragged my trembling body off the thin mattress and slowly began the torturous journey across the concrete basement floor. Reaching the wooden staircase, I gripped the handrail so tightly my knuckles turned completely white. Every single upward step required me to lift my entire body weight, using only my arms and my good leg, desperately trying to protect my torn abdominal muscles. I stopped on every single stair, gasping for air, as tears of pure, unadulterated pain streamed down my pale face. It took 20 excruciating minutes to reach the main floor. The house was surprisingly quiet. The chaos of the relatives temporarily paused in sleep. I kept moving, dragging my heavy feet up the grand glass staircase toward the master suite. My vision blurred, violently, dark spots dancing across my eyes as my blood pressure dangerously fluctuated. I finally reached the heavy double doors of my bedroom. I pushed them open desperately, hoping to quietly slip into the ensuite bathroom and retrieve my critical medication. Instead, I froze in absolute horror at the sight before me. Patricia was wide awake, lounging luxuriously in the exact center of my custom bed. She was wearing my extremely expensive, pure silk designer robe, the one I had specifically purchased for my hospital recovery. She held a steaming cup of my premium espresso in one hand and a fashion magazine in the other. She looked completely comfortable, entirely undisturbed by the fact that she was actively occupying a bleeding woman's sanctuary. My sanctuary. The sheer audacity of her relaxed posture made my blood boil momentarily, overriding the blinding physical agony tearing through my stomach. I leaned heavily against the wooden doorframe, practically gasping for breath as I demanded to know where my prescription medication was. I pointed desperately toward the open bathroom door, telling her I needed the orange bottles from the top shelf immediately. Patricia slowly lowered her fashion magazine and took a highly deliberate, agonizingly slow sip of her espresso. She looked me up and down with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. She coldly announced that the shelf was completely empty. My heart plummeted directly into my stomach. I frantically asked her what she had done with them. Patricia smiled, a sickeningly proud smirk spreading across her wrinkled face. She freely admitted that she had thrown all of my heavy painkillers directly into the outside trash bin the previous night. She smugly called the necessary medication toxic garbage, claiming that modern doctors overprescribe dangerous narcotics to lazy women. She aggressively accused me of using the heavy pills as a pathetic, calculated excuse to stay in bed and entirely avoid my fundamental hosting duties. She told me to simply take an over-the-counter aspirin and get downstairs to start making breakfast for her grandchildren. Before I could even process the terrifying reality that my mother-in-law had intentionally disposed of my vital medical lifeline. Heavy footsteps approached from the hallway behind me. Richard appeared fully dressed in his highly expensive golf attire, looking incredibly annoyed by the early morning confrontation. I turned to my husband in absolute desperation, frantically explaining that his mother had just thrown away my highly controlled, medically necessary prescription painkillers. I begged him to go outside and retrieve them from the garbage before the severe pain sent me into shock. Instead of showing even a sliver of concern for his bleeding wife, Richard's face twisted in pure anger toward me. He aggressively stepped between me and his mother, physically blocking my path to the bathroom. He sternly scolded me for maliciously harassing Patricia over what he casually dismissed as just some basic pills. He told me I was acting like a hysterical addict and aggressively ordered me to stop disrespecting his mother in her room. He completely ignored my visibly violent, uncontrollable physical trembling and the fresh blood seeping through my thin gown. He firmly told me to get out of Patricia's sight and go back down to the dark basement immediately before I completely ruined everyone's peaceful morning routine and embarrassed him. The descent back into the basement was a blur of pure physical trauma. Banished from my own bedroom by the man who swore to protect me, I dragged my battered, bleeding body down the wooden stairs for the second time. I did not crawl. I simply slid down the steps on my side, allowing my heavy limbs to drop from one wooden tread to the next, too exhausted to even fight the agonizing gravity. Every jolt sent fresh waves of blinding agony ripping through my sliced abdomen. By the time I reached the concrete floor, my vision was swimming with violent dark spots. I dragged myself across the freezing dust and collapsed onto the damp guest mattress. My physical condition was rapidly deteriorating. My internal temperature spiked violently, hitting 103 degrees. I lay there shivering uncontrollably, my teeth chattering so hard my jaw began to aggressively ache. The thick dark shadows of the windowless room pressed heavily against me. I was entirely alone. My husband was upstairs laughing over coffee. My mother-in-law was lounging in my expensive silk robes, and my sister-in-law was letting her feral children dismantle my beautiful sanctuary. The sheer suffocating isolation of my reality pressed down on my chest like a physical weight. No one was coming to save me. If my fresh surgical incisions ruptured completely, I would simply bleed to death right here on this cheap mattress, and Richard would probably just complain about the permanent stain on the concrete. I wrapped my trembling arms tightly around my burning torso, curling into a tight defensive ball as the severe unmedicated pain threatened to completely shut down my nervous system. But then something inside of me fundamentally snapped. As I lay in the freezing darkness listening to the heavy entitled footsteps stomping across the ceiling directly above my head, the endless stream of desperate, pathetic tears completely stopped. The hot, stinging salt water dried up against my feverish cheeks. The overwhelming, crushing grief over my husband's brutal cruelty, the desperate need for his love, his validation, and his protection simply burned away in the heat of my severe fever. It evaporated into nothing, leaving behind a profound, echoing emptiness. That heavy, suffocating sadness was instantly replaced by an absolute ice-cold clarity. My breathing slowed down, becoming highly deliberate and shallow to protect my stitches. The frantic, terrified fluttering in my chest ceased completely. I stopped viewing myself as a helpless, suffering wife desperately pleading for basic human decency from a monster. I stared straight up at the exposed wooden joists of the ceiling, my vision sharpening despite the intense physical agony radiating from my core. The woman who had blindly financed Richard's luxurious lifestyle. The woman who had tolerated Patricia's endless insults for the sake of family harmony. And the woman who had begged for her own pain medication just died in that freezing, damp basement. She was gone forever. In her place, a completely different entity took over. The paralyzing fear of my vulnerable medical state vanished entirely, overridden by a deeply primal, calculating focus. I was no longer a victim trapped in the dark. My incredibly sharp analytical mind, the exact same mind that had successfully built a highly lucrative tech agency from scratch, finally booted up. I began to process the last 48 hours, not through the blurry lens of emotional trauma, but through the highly objective lens of forensic analysis. I meticulously pieced every single event together. Richard aggressively inviting 15 people exactly when I was physically incapacitated. Patricia violently evicting me from the master bedroom to isolate me in the basement. Rachel's children systematically destroying my expensive office equipment to cut off my professional communication. Richard happily stealing my necessary medical nutrition to deliberately weaken my physical stamina. Patricia intentionally throwing away my heavy prescription painkillers to ensure I remained entirely paralyzed by agony. I realized with absolute certainty that this was not just standard family thoughtlessness. This was not a simple lack of empathy or a series of unfortunate, selfish misunderstandings. This was a highly coordinated, strategic effort to completely break my spirit. They were actively working together to grind me down to absolute nothingness, banking entirely on my physical weakness to keep me docile and compliant. They wanted me entirely broken, subservient, and too terrified to fight back against their total occupation of my home. The realization was entirely liberating. If this was a war, then I was officially ready to fight. The bleeding, terrified victim was dead, and the predator had just awakened. I slowly pushed myself up against the cold cinder block wall, ignoring the blinding pain radiating from my sliced abdomen. I forced my shaking hands to stop trembling. I grabbed my smartphone from the damp mattress and unlocked the glowing screen. I was done begging for my own survival. I was shifting entirely out of survival mode and moving directly into calculating, ruthless retaliation. I needed to know exactly what their ultimate endgame was. They were not simply acting out of spontaneous spite or petty malice. There was a specific tangible goal they were trying to achieve by keeping me locked away, completely isolated and severely weakened in my own basement. If they were working this hard to break me, there was a massive, highly lucrative reason behind it. I knew Richard better than anyone. He was incredibly greedy, but he was also exceptionally arrogant and fundamentally careless. He always left a trail. I just needed to find it. I took a slow, painful breath and opened my highly encrypted digital security folder. I was going to use their absolute arrogant confidence against them. They firmly believed I was rotting in the dark, too weak to even stand, much less dismantle their entire lives. They had no idea they had just declared war on the most dangerous person in the room. I began to strategize, plotting exactly how I would utterly destroy every single one of them. My thumb hovered over the glowing screen of my smartphone as a highly specific tactical memory surfaced through the feverish haze. Several months ago, long before this medical nightmare or this orchestrated home invasion ever began, I had completely overhauled the physical security of my house. As the owner of a highly successful digital design agency, my home office housed incredibly sensitive prototype data, unreleased client interfaces, and tens of thousands of dollars in specialized server equipment. Standard security systems with obvious cameras and bulky wall mounts felt entirely insufficient and easily bypassable. Instead, I had discreetly contracted a premium private security firm to install a cutting-edge, completely invisible surveillance network. They integrated state-of-the-art microscopic cameras directly into the hardwired smoke detectors in every single main room of the house. These were not cheap generic retail cameras. They were military-grade optical lenses entirely flush with the white plastic casings designed to blend in flawlessly with the ceiling architecture. They provided an unobstructed panoramic view of the kitchen, the formal living room, the main hallways, and my private studio. I had installed them primarily to ensure the absolute integrity of my intellectual property while I was traveling for corporate conferences. I wanted unquestionable proof if anyone ever attempted to tamper with my agency servers. Sitting in the freezing damp basement, completely stripped of my physical mobility and basic human dignity, I realized this extreme paranoia was now my absolute greatest hidden advantage. They thought they had effectively blinded me by locking me in the dark away from the main floor. They were entirely wrong. I had absolute unblinking eyes on every single inch of their newly claimed territory. My greatest asset was not just the invisible hardware itself, but my husband's absolute willful ignorance of its existence. Richard was incredibly financially greedy, but he was also fundamentally lazy and entirely technologically incompetent. Throughout our entire marriage, he relied exclusively on me for absolutely every technical matter. I set up his smartphones, managed our digital financial portfolios, configured the wireless network, and even programmed the smart thermostat because he claimed it was too complicated to learn. When the private security technicians came to upgrade the fire alarms months ago, Richard did not ask a single question. He simply complained about the brief noise of the drills and went right back to watching television. He firmly believed the devices on the ceiling were nothing more than standard-issue annoying smoke detectors. He had absolutely no idea that the microscopic lenses were connected to a highly secure, heavily encrypted cloud server that I exclusively controlled. More importantly, he had no idea that the system did not just capture high-definition video. Each hidden unit was also equipped with highly sensitive omnidirectional ambient microphones designed to filter out background static and record crystal-clear courtroom admissible audio. The system was meticulously programmed to pick up a whisper from completely across the room. Richard and his deeply toxic family were currently operating under the incredibly arrogant assumption that what happens on the main floor stays completely secret from the bleeding woman trapped in the basement. They felt entirely safe to speak freely, coordinate their malicious efforts, and display their true, unfiltered cruelty without any fear of observation. They were moving confidently through my house, totally unaware they were performing on a fully recorded stage. My hands were shaking violently from the severe fever, but my mind was operating with terrifying absolute precision. I gripped my smartphone tightly and swiped past my standard applications, burying deep into a hidden password-protected folder. I tapped the highly discreet black icon that operated the master security network. A biometric prompt flashed on the bright screen. I pressed my thumb firmly against the glass, ignoring the sharp, throbbing pain radiating from my sliced abdomen as I held my breath. The encrypted feed immediately verified my identity and unlocked the master dashboard. A grid of completely black squares populated the screen, each one representing a different room in my captured house. It was just past 2 in the morning. The heavy, relentless footsteps of Rachel's undisciplined children had finally ceased hours ago. The chaotic daytime noise had completely settled into a heavy, suffocating silence. I slowly scrolled down the list of active camera nodes, bypassing the dark kitchen and the empty hallways. I specifically located the primary node designated for the formal living room. With a trembling finger, I tapped the screen to initiate the live connection. A small rotating loading icon appeared for 2 agonizing seconds as the system bypassed the local network and pulled the heavy data stream directly from the secure cloud. The black square instantly illuminated, flooding my phone screen with a pristine full-color night vision broadcast. The image was incredibly sharp, providing a perfect high-definition view of the entire living room. The rest of the house had completely gone to sleep, but the core architects of my misery were still wide awake. Richard, Patricia, and George were sitting comfortably around my custom marble coffee table. They were casually illuminated by the soft, warm glow of the modern fireplace. I zoomed in on the center of the table and felt a fresh wave of absolute disgust wash over me. Sitting between them was a highly distinctive dark glass bottle. It was my exclusive $500 reserve wine, a highly rare vintage I had specifically purchased at a charity auction to celebrate the future 5-year anniversary of my design agency. Richard had boldly broken the wax seal and poured generous, heavy glasses for his parents. They were actively toasting to themselves, their faces relaxed into smug, deeply satisfied smiles. Patricia kicked her feet up onto my expensive velvet sofa, swirling the dark red liquid in her glass, while George laughed quietly at something Richard just said. They were having a highly exclusive celebratory late-night meeting long after the chaotic children and the rest of the extended family had retired to the guest bedrooms. I reached out and tapped the small microphone icon on my screen, unmuting the live audio feed and bringing their quiet, confident voices directly into the freezing darkness of my basement cell. The faint, ambient hiss of the high-fidelity microphone instantly filled the cold, damp air of my basement cell, effectively erasing the physical distance between my bleeding body and their comfortable celebration. I shifted my weight agonizingly on the thin mattress, ensuring my phone screen remained perfectly angled. My thumb aggressively hovered directly over the bright red screen record button built into the security application interface. I knew with absolute certainty that whatever they were discussing at 2 in the morning while drinking my most expensive reserve wine was not innocent family banter. I held my breath, entirely ignoring the searing, burning pain radiating across my surgical incisions. I needed absolute silence on my end to ensure I did not miss a single syllable of their late-night conversation. The audio feed was incredibly pristine, picking up the delicate clinking of the expensive crystal glasses and the soft crackling of the modern fireplace logs. Richard leaned back against the plush velvet cushions of my custom sofa, his entire posture radiating an overwhelming, unearned arrogance. He took a long, arrogant sip of the dark red wine, visibly savoring the highly expensive vintage he had absolutely zero part in purchasing. George sat quietly beside him, his heavy eyes reflecting the warm firelight, while Patricia leaned forward across the marble coffee table. Her usual shrill, demanding tone was entirely absent. Instead, she spoke in a highly controlled, deeply serious whisper that immediately sent a fresh, terrifying chill racing down my spine. This was a calculated business meeting, not a casual family gathering. I pressed my thumb firmly down against the glass screen. The red recording indicator instantly illuminated, officially capturing every single second of their highly confidential exchange directly onto my heavily encrypted, secure digital storage drive. I watched the digital timer counting. Patricia swirled the dark wine in her glass, her eyes locked intensely on her son. She lowered her voice even further, leaning so close to the hidden camera microphone that I could practically feel her toxic breath. She asked Richard directly if he was absolutely sure the money was going to clear the bank on time. The word money hung heavily in the air, instantly freezing the blood in my veins. My mind raced frantically, trying to calculate exactly what financial transaction she could possibly be referring to. Patricia continued speaking, her tone laced with urgent, desperate greed. She reminded Richard that his sister Rachel was drowning in massive credit card debts and desperately needed a substantial bailout to stop the aggressive collection agencies. She then pointed directly at George, firmly stating that his failing construction business desperately needed a massive cash injection by the end of the month just to keep the commercial doors open. She explicitly demanded absolute reassurance that the massive payout was entirely secured. She warned Richard that they could not afford any sudden delays or unexpected legal complications, especially considering the massive financial risks he had apparently taken to secure the incoming funds. My entire body went completely rigid on the damp mattress. The sheer magnitude of their hidden conversation was rapidly coming into terrifying focus. They were not just discussing a minor personal loan or a small transfer from his personal savings account. They were actively coordinating the distribution of a massive, life-altering financial windfall. Rachel's feral children destroying my house, and Patricia's violent, cruel eviction of my bleeding body from the master suite were not just acts of random malice. They were highly calculated distractions, designed to keep me entirely isolated, while a massive transaction was secretly finalized right beneath my nose. Richard threw his head back against the velvet sofa cushions and let out a loud, arrogant burst of laughter. The sheer confidence in his dark eyes made me physically nauseous. He smiled broadly, swirling his expensive wine, and told his mother to relax. He boasted that he took care of everything, insisting that his foolproof plan was secure. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and smugly explained his deceptive strategy. He proudly stated that I had been out of it from the heavy surgical pain and the severe fever. He confirmed that I was so incapacitated by my complex medical trauma that I had not bothered to look at my professional emails or check my secure financial accounts for days. He gloated about successfully isolating me in the dark basement, disconnected from my standard digital life. He assured Patricia that I was far too weak and heavily distracted by my own physical suffering to notice the electronic notifications hitting my private inbox. He casually brushed off her intense anxieties, arrogantly declaring that by the time I eventually recovered enough strength to log into my secure banking portals, the massive transfer would already be completed and completely irreversible. The heavy truth slammed directly into my chest with the terrifying force of a speeding freight train. This chaotic home invasion was never about a simple family reunion. It was a premature celebration of a massive financial windfall stolen directly from my private accounts. Richard had successfully manufactured this entire weekend nightmare to keep my attention completely focused on my physical survival and his deeply toxic family members. He actively weaponized my painful surgical recovery to create the perfect distraction-filled window of opportunity to commit secret financial theft. My husband was happily liquidating my hard-earned assets to aggressively fund his sister's reckless spending and save his father's failing business. Every single cruel insult, the stolen medical food, and the intentionally discarded painkillers were all deliberate tactics deployed to keep me utterly defenseless while he robbed me blind. I stared at the glowing phone screen, watching the man I had married happily toast to my complete financial destruction. My bleeding body was shivering in the freezing darkness, but my mind was burning with an explosive, blinding rage. They thought they had successfully destroyed me, but they had absolutely no idea they just handed me the exact weapon I needed. I stared intensely at the high-definition broadcast glowing on my phone screen, my heart hammering violently against my bruised ribs. The red recording indicator pulsed silently in the top corner, capturing every devastating second of my husband's treachery. Richard leaned completely forward, resting his expensive glass on the marble coffee table, and finally laid out the horrifying scope of his financial theft. He proudly announced to his captive, greedy audience that he had successfully secured a massive home equity line of credit directly against the total appraised value of my house. The exact figure he casually tossed into the air made the blood freeze entirely in my veins. $300,000. He boasted that he had been secretly communicating with a highly aggressive private lender for the past 3 weeks, carefully timing the massive equity withdrawal to align perfectly with my scheduled fibroid surgery. He knew everything about my financial standing, including the massive amount of clear equity I had painstakingly built up in the property before we were married. Patricia clapped her hands together in sheer delight, praising her son for his brilliant financial maneuvering. She aggressively congratulated him for taking what she claimed was rightfully his, ignoring the fact that he had absolutely zero legal claim to the assets I acquired entirely on my own. George simply nodded approvingly, his eyes shining with the greedy anticipation of a massive bailout for his mismanaged construction business. They were sitting in my beautiful living room, drinking my expensive wine, and happily dividing up a $300,000 bounty stolen directly from the very walls surrounding them. The mechanics of his massive crime were the most chilling part of his confession. Richard did not just quietly siphon money from a checking account. He brazenly admitted to actively committing a highly complex, aggressive federal felony. He explained to his deeply impressed parents exactly how he bypassed the strict security protocols required for such a massive property loan. He loudly confessed that he intercepted the highly secure digital closing documents sent directly to my private email address. While I was lying entirely incapacitated in the sterile recovery room at the surgical clinic, pumped full of heavy anesthetics and incapable of opening my eyes, my husband coldly accessed my personal smartphone. He proudly detailed how he used my biometric data to unlock my secure email application while I was unconscious. Then he confidently admitted to actively forging my secure digital signature on the binding loan agreements, legally authorizing the massive $300,000 lien against my private property. He laughed as he described mimicking my electronic verification process, completely bypassing the automated security checks established by the private lender. He had effectively mortgaged my future while I was physically bleeding on an operating table, trusting him to monitor my vital signs. He arrogantly told Patricia that the lender accepted the forged documents without a single question, entirely fooled by his confident impersonation. He successfully hijacked my identity to steal a massive fortune, legally binding me to a devastating debt I had absolutely no knowledge of. Just as Richard finished detailing his massive federal crime, the heavy wooden door to the main hallway slowly opened. Rachel stepped quietly into the living room, wearing her expensive silk pajamas, having clearly overheard the end of his brazen confession. She walked over to the velvet sofa and aggressively poured herself a large glass of my reserve wine. She looked directly at Richard, a flicker of genuine anxiety crossing her sharp features. She bluntly asked him what would happen when I inevitably noticed the massive $300,000 debt suddenly attached to my pristine credit profile. Richard aggressively scoffed at his sister, rolling his dark eyes in absolute contempt. He waved his hand dismissively, aggressively, claiming that I was far too weak and heavily medicated to ever figure out the complex financial trail he had carefully buried. But his ultimate defense was far more insulting than his reliance on my physical trauma. He smugly declared that even if I eventually discovered the massive fraud, I would never actually do anything about it. He confidently claimed that I was entirely obsessed with maintaining the outward appearance of a perfectly happy, highly successful marriage. He told his family that I was far too deeply ashamed of failure and terrified of public scandal to ever report my own husband to the police. He arrogantly assured Rachel that I would absorb the massive financial blow in complete silence, choosing to quietly pay off the stolen loan just to avoid a highly messy public divorce. He firmly believed I was a spineless, pathetic victim who would choose social reputation over my own financial survival. I stared at the man I had loved and trusted, listening to him fundamentally miscalculate exactly who I was and what I was capable of. His absolute blind arrogance was completely breathtaking. He sincerely believed his cruel psychological manipulation had entirely broken my spirit. He was completely wrong. My finger hovered over the bright red screen record button on my smartphone. The digital timer ticked past the 10-minute mark, securely capturing every single arrogant word, every malicious laugh, and every highly detailed confession of federal wire fraud and severe identity theft. I took a very slow, shallow breath, ignoring the sharp, tearing pain in my sliced abdomen. I firmly pressed the red button, immediately ending the active recording. A bright green notification instantly flashed across my screen, confirming that the massive high-definition video file was securely saved directly to my heavily encrypted cloud storage drive. I instantly duplicated the file, sending a highly secure backup directly to my secondary private server. I now possessed an absolutely pristine, legally binding audio and video confession of multiple highly severe federal crimes, completely orchestrated and explicitly detailed by the perpetrators themselves. They had arrogantly handed me the exact rope I needed to securely hang them all. My hands completely stopped shaking. The intense burning fever faded into the background, entirely replaced by a freezing, deeply calculated determination. I locked my phone screen and slowly lowered myself back onto the damp basement mattress. I was no longer a terrified, bleeding wife trapped in a dark room. I was the absolute architect of their imminent, highly public destruction. The pristine audio feed from the hidden smoke detector camera continued to broadcast directly into my dark, freezing basement cell. I kept my trembling finger securely off the sensitive phone screen, terrified of accidentally muting the live digital feed as the conversation upstairs took a massive, horrifying turn. Patricia leaned aggressively across the expensive marble coffee table, her sharp features harshly illuminated by the warm, flickering firelight. She was dropping the facade of a caring, concerned mother-in-law. She was acting as the pragmatic general of a highly coordinated hostile takeover. She lowered her voice to a harsh, demanding whisper, commanding Richard to listen extremely carefully. She instructed him to immediately contact his sleazy downtown divorce lawyer the exact second the banks opened on Monday morning. The massive $300,000 fraudulent loan was scheduled to fully clear into his private offshore checking account by early Friday afternoon. Patricia firmly dictated that the absolute second he received the digital banking confirmation of the cash deposit, he was to aggressively serve me with divorce papers. She wanted the legal ambush executed flawlessly, while I was still physically bleeding, entirely exhausted, and heavily confined to the concrete basement. She demanded that he claim severe, irreconcilable differences, heavily citing my alleged emotional instability and complete failure to properly host his visiting family during my medical recovery. She was actively coaching my arrogant husband on exactly how to legally weaponize my painful surgical trauma to execute a swift, brutally devastating divorce without offering me any chance to properly defend myself or my valuable financial assets. She wanted me blindsided, physically weak, and entirely incapable of hiring my own legal representation before the heavy paperwork was officially filed with the local county courts. The sheer calculated cruelty of Patricia's ultimate endgame was completely breathtaking. She was not just satisfied with successfully stealing $300,000 of my hard-earned equity. She wanted absolutely everything I had ever built in my entire adult life. She smugly explained the brutal legal mechanics of her master plan to the greedy family sitting in my living room. Under our current state marital property laws, regardless of my sole financial contribution to the original down payment and the monthly mortgage, all remaining property equity would be subjected to a mandated 50-50 split upon a sudden divorce decree. Patricia confidently explained that once I was legally forced to divide the heavily depleted remaining value of the house, I would be entirely financially crippled. Then, in a move of pure financial evil, she instructed Richard to aggressively use the exact same $300,000 he had secretly stolen from my equity to officially buy out my remaining half of the property. They were planning to legally purchase my own beautiful house right out from under me, using my own stolen money. And the final sickening twist to this malicious plot was strictly reserved for Rachel. Patricia proudly turned to her daughter and promised her that once I was officially evicted and entirely financially ruined, Rachel and her feral children would immediately move into my pristine, custom-built home on a permanent basis. They were literally plotting to replace me with his deadbeat sister, actively transforming my highly successful life's work into a free, luxurious family compound for his parasitic relatives. Rachel would get the massive kitchen she always coveted. George would get my custom design studio for his failed business office, and I would be left completely homeless and heavily burdened with their fraudulently acquired debt. Richard, George, and Rachel looked at Patricia with absolute, unadulterated awe. They were entirely captivated by the sheer ruthless brilliance of her highly malicious scheme. Richard aggressively poured the very last drops of my $500 reserve wine into their expensive crystal glasses. He stood up from the velvet sofa, a massive, triumphant grin plastered across his arrogant face. He raised his dark glass high into the warm air of my custom living room, actively demanding a celebratory toast from his deeply toxic family. He confidently declared that they were finally taking back exactly what they deserved from a woman who always thought she was entirely superior to them. Rachel eagerly clinked her glass against his, loudly laughing as she offered her own disgusting addition to the late-night toast. She happily referred to me not as her generous sister-in-law, nor as a human being currently recovering from a major surgical procedure, but simply as their completely clueless ATM. The entire room erupted into genuine roaring laughter. They gleefully drank my expensive wine, happily celebrating my absolute financial and personal destruction as if it was a highly lucrative corporate acquisition. They were thoroughly enjoying the absolute peak of their temporary stolen victory. Down in the freezing, damp darkness of the basement, a highly unexpected physical reaction occurred. Despite the blinding, agonizing pain radiating from my sliced abdomen, and despite the heavy, suffocating isolation of my concrete cell, the corners of my mouth slowly curled upward. I smiled. It was a cold, highly dangerous smile born entirely out of pure, calculated malice. I lay back against the cheap, dusty mattress, staring firmly at the dark ceiling joists above my head. I let them enjoy their arrogant, malicious laughter echoing through the hidden audio feed. They were loudly celebrating a massive victory they had not actually won. They were completely blinded by their own immense greed and absolute arrogance, entirely unaware of the massive, highly explosive legal minefield they had just confidently stepped into. Richard foolishly believed the house belonged to him simply because we were legally married and he lived there. He was completely wrong. My home was never placed in his name. It was legally owned and heavily protected by a completely separate, highly secure blind trust limited liability company that I had established years ago. I took a slow, highly controlled breath, feeling the absolute power of this hidden reality wash over me. The trap was already set. The heavy, suffocating darkness of the basement felt entirely different now. It was no longer a prison. It was my tactical command center. I pulled my smartphone closer to my chest, ignoring the sharp, biting pain radiating from my fresh surgical wounds. My thumb swiftly navigated away from the hidden surveillance application and opened my highly secure, heavily encrypted financial portfolio. The biometric scanner confirmed my identity, unlocking a complex dashboard of global assets, corporate holding accounts, and private investments that my greedy husband knew absolutely nothing about. Upstairs, Richard was currently sleeping deeply, completely intoxicated by his own perceived brilliance and my expensive reserve wine. He rested comfortably under the incredibly foolish assumption that he had successfully executed the perfect financial crime. In his deeply limited, arrogant mind, he firmly believed my personal name was printed directly on the primary property deed. He calculated his entire theft based on that single fatal assumption. He thought that by forging my digital signature on the home equity line of credit, he was simply committing a minor localized fraud against his own wife. He assumed that even if he was eventually caught, the local authorities would largely dismiss the incident as a messy, complicated marital dispute over shared community property. He banked his entire future on the belief that spousal immunity and standard divorce proceedings would effectively shield him from any severe criminal liability. He thought he was playing a simple domestic game against a physically broken woman. He was completely and utterly wrong. He had fundamentally misunderstood the entire legal foundation of our marital residence. Exactly 2 years prior, long before his toxic family began actively invading my space, and long before my physical health required surgical intervention, I made a massive, highly strategic financial maneuver. I consulted with a top-tier corporate attorney and aggressively restructured my entire personal estate. I legally transferred the absolute uncontested ownership of this beautiful $1.5 million property entirely out of my own personal name. I seamlessly moved the physical real estate into a highly complex, aggressively protected blind trust. This trust was not a simple family placeholder. It was explicitly and legally controlled by my primary corporate entity, a heavily fortified limited liability company that managed my highly lucrative tech agency. I executed this massive transfer specifically to shield my most valuable personal assets from any potential corporate litigation, but it unknowingly created an impenetrable fortress against domestic theft. Richard completely missed this massive legal shift because he was fundamentally lazy and entirely uninterested in the boring, complex realities of my corporate success. He never bothered to read the thick legal documents arriving in the mail, and he never asked any intelligent questions about how our taxes were suddenly being filed through a corporate accountant. He just enjoyed the luxurious lifestyle my money provided, totally oblivious to the ironclad legal structures I had built directly beneath his feet. Because the property was legally owned by the corporate trust, Richard's brazen financial crime instantly transformed into a catastrophic legal nightmare. By accessing my private email and actively forging my digital signature on those binding loan documents, he had not simply bypassed a trusting spouse. He had aggressively attempted to defraud a massive, heavily regulated corporate entity. The signature he so confidently faked was not just the personal authorization of a vulnerable wife. It was the legally binding authorization of a corporate chief executive officer executing a major financial transaction on behalf of an established corporate trust. He bypassed standard domestic fraud and boldly crossed directly into the realm of major corporate espionage and aggressive wire fraud. The private lender who approved the $300,000 home equity line of credit believed they were conducting a standard business commercial transaction, completely unaware they were being actively manipulated by an unauthorized domestic imposter. Richard foolishly believed he was stealing equity from a standard residential home, but he was actually attempting to illegally siphon massive capital directly from a highly protected corporate vault. The sheer scale of his legal ignorance was absolutely staggering. He had unknowingly triggered a cascade of severe corporate security protocols that were legally designed to aggressively hunt down and completely destroy sophisticated financial hackers and corporate embezzlers. These protocols were absolute and completely unforgiving, operating entirely outside the realm of standard human empathy or basic familial forgiveness. The financial institution would aggressively pursue every single stolen cent. The full devastating magnitude of his arrogant error was about to detonate his entire life. The $300,000 fraudulent loan was scheduled to clear into his private offshore account by Friday afternoon. However, the exact moment the private lender attempted to legally attach the financial lien to the actual property deed, the automated corporate security systems would instantly trigger a massive alarm. The bank would immediately flag the transaction as highly suspicious because the title did not match an individual citizen, but rather a commercial corporate trust. This unavoidable legal mismatch would automatically alert the highly aggressive, legally mandated compliance officer attached to my limited liability company. Once the compliance officer officially recognized the forged executive signature, they were legally obligated by strict federal regulations to immediately report the massive fraud directly to federal law enforcement agencies. Richard would not be dealing with a sympathetic local police officer handling a messy domestic dispute. He would be facing highly trained federal investigators who specialized in complex corporate wire fraud, severe identity theft, and commercial banking manipulation. His petty attempt to fund his sister's shopping addiction and his father's failing business had successfully upgraded his crime into a massive, heavily prosecuted federal offense carrying mandatory long-term federal prison sentences. He had proudly built his own legal coffin and confidently hammered every single nail into place. I lay in the freezing darkness, my physical pain entirely eclipsed by the burning anticipation of his imminent destruction. I just needed to survive the night, to execute the final steps of my flawless retaliation. The freezing basement air bit harshly against my exposed skin as the digital clock on my smartphone slowly rolled over to exactly 3 in the morning. Upstairs, the heavy, suffocating silence of a sleeping house confirmed that Richard and his deeply toxic family had finally retreated to their stolen bedrooms. They were completely unconscious, entirely oblivious to the massive digital vault I had just firmly locked around them. My physical pain was absolutely agonizing, a relentless burning fire radiating from my fresh surgical incisions with every shallow breath I took. But my mind was operating with a terrifying crystal-clear precision. I knew I could not execute this massive retaliation entirely alone from a damp mattress. I needed outside firepower, and I needed it immediately before the sun came up and my physical strength failed completely. I gripped my smartphone with violently trembling hands and opened my secure contact list. I bypassed my local friends and standard business associates, scrolling directly to the only 2 people on Earth I trusted with my absolute survival. I tapped the heavily encrypted speed dial for my younger sister Lily and her husband Andre. My thumb lingered on the glass screen for a fraction of a second, acutely aware of the incredibly late hour. Waking them up at 3 in the morning was a massive violation of standard family boundaries, but standard family boundaries had permanently died the exact moment Richard forged my signature to steal $300,000. I pressed the call button and pressed the cold glass firmly against my ear, holding my breath to mask the painful shivering of my jaw. The line rang twice before the connection clicked open, bringing the hushed, concerned voice of my sister directly into my dark cell. Lily answered with a sharp intake of breath, instantly recognizing the severity of a secure call at this hour. Before she could even articulate a full sentence of panic, I heard the distinct rustling of heavy sheets and the deep, commanding voice of her husband taking over the receiver. Andre was not a man easily startled by sudden midnight emergencies. He was a brilliantly ruthless, highly successful Black African-American forensic accountant and a severely aggressive corporate lawyer. He had spent his entire professional career dismantling highly complex financial frauds and legally crushing corrupt executives in massive federal courtrooms. He possessed an incredibly sharp, highly analytical mind that processed chaotic disasters with absolute chilling efficiency. Furthermore, Andre absolutely despised Richard. From the very first day they met, Andre had seen right through Richard's fake charm and aggressively arrogant posturing. He had frequently warned me that my husband was fundamentally parasitic, a lazy opportunist who secretly resented my immense financial success. I had spent years actively defending Richard to my family, foolishly trying to maintain the fragile illusion of a perfectly happy, supportive marriage. Now bleeding in the dark and completely betrayed, I was finally ready to admit that Andre had been absolutely right all along. I could hear the immediate shift in his breathing as he took the phone from Lily, instantly transitioning from a sleeping husband into a highly tactical legal predator. He did not ask how I was feeling or waste time with standard sympathetic platitudes. He demanded to know exactly what was happening and what kind of immediate legal intervention I required. His deep, steady voice anchored me entirely, cutting straight through the overwhelming physical agony and the chaotic trauma of the freezing night. I forced myself to speak in a highly controlled, raspy whisper, keeping my voice barely above the ambient hiss of the basement ventilation system. I could not risk the sound traveling up the wooden stairs. I quickly laid out the entire horrifying reality of my current situation. I told Andre that Richard had isolated me in the freezing basement immediately following my major abdominal surgery, cutting off my access to pain medication and proper medical nutrition. I heard a sharp, aggressive curse from Lily in the background, but Andre remained entirely silent, absorbing the raw data. I then dropped the massive, highly explosive legal bombshell. I explicitly detailed the forged $300,000 home equity line of credit, explaining exactly how Richard had bypassed my biometric security to sign the binding loan documents while I was unconscious at the surgical clinic. I quickly explained Patricia's cruel divorce plot, outlining their coordinated strategy to legally serve me the exact moment the stolen funds cleared into his private offshore account on Friday afternoon. Finally, I confidently revealed that I had just successfully secured completely pristine, legally binding audio and video recordings of their entire malicious conspiracy using my hidden corporate security cameras. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute stretching for 3 long, heavy seconds. When Andre finally spoke, his reaction was chillingly calm and incredibly professional. There was no chaotic shouting, no performative outrage, and no useless emotional panic. He simply let out a low, deeply satisfied hum that resonated with pure, highly calculated menace. He instantly grasped the massive, overwhelming legal leverage I currently held in my trembling hands. He quickly confirmed the structural reality of the property deed, verifying that the house was indeed strictly owned by my corporate blind trust and completely untouchable by standard marital divorce proceedings. Andre explicitly stated that Richard had just confidently walked into a massive federal trap that he could never escape. He began formulating the precise sequential steps for the ultimate takedown. He ordered me to remain entirely silent and compliant for the rest of the night, warning me not to alert Richard to my sudden awareness of his massive crime. Andre promised he would personally contact the corporate compliance officer the second the business day started, ensuring the federal wire fraud alarms were permanently tripped. The bleeding victim was officially partnering with the ultimate corporate predator, and Richard had absolutely no idea the devastating legal avalanche that was about to completely crush his entire stolen life. Andre's deep voice vibrated through the speaker, entirely devoid of panic, but heavily saturated with tactical, calculated aggression. He began to meticulously outline the exact parameters of the massive legal trap we were about to completely seal around my arrogant husband. Andre aggressively insisted that we could not simply cancel the loan immediately or alert the authorities right this second. He explained that if we prematurely halted the financial transaction before the massive banking institution officially generated the secondary heavily verified approval documents, Richard could easily hire a defense attorney to potentially argue it was merely a desperate misunderstanding or a simple failed digital inquiry. We needed an absolute, undeniable, heavily fortified federal paper trail to ensure his permanent destruction. Andre strictly instructed me to completely allow the bank to seamlessly process the initial primary stage of the heavy financial approval. By letting the deeply corrupt transaction move forward just enough to generate the official routing numbers and the finalized digital signatures on the private lender's primary servers, Richard's severe financial crime would immediately transition from a simple fraudulent attempt into a fully executed, heavily documented federal felony. The bank's massive corporate mainframes would permanently lock in his forged digital footprint, securely capturing the exact Internet protocol address and the precise biometric bypass he utilized on my stolen smartphone while I was lying bleeding in the recovery room. Andre coldly assured me this highly calculated delay was the absolute ultimate weapon in our legal arsenal. We were actively giving Richard just enough financial rope to permanently hang himself in a federal courtroom, ensuring there was absolutely no possibility of a plea deal. The exact timing of our aggressive counterstrike was absolutely critical to the success of the entire operation. Andre meticulously mapped out the morning schedule with the ruthless, unyielding precision of a military commander coordinating a massive airstrike. He firmly promised that exactly at 8 in the morning, the very second the primary commercial banking systems came online and their highly secure internal fraud departments opened their direct phone lines, he would violently strike. Acting as the official legally designated compliance officer and lead corporate counsel for my secure limited liability company, Andre would directly contact the absolute highest tier of the bank's corporate security division. He would not simply report a suspicious charge or a questionable login attempt. He was going to aggressively execute a massive legally binding corporate freeze on the entire $300,000 transfer. By officially declaring the massive transaction a hostile, fraudulent attack against a registered corporate entity rather than a standard marital dispute, Andre would instantly force the bank's internal security systems to completely lock the stolen funds in transit. This highly aggressive corporate freeze would completely bypass the standard slow-moving customer service representatives and automatically trigger an immediate legally mandated alert directly to the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The federal government maintained incredibly strict, unforgiving oversight on massive corporate wire frauds. Once that heavily documented flag was permanently raised within the banking system, Richard's desperate attempt to secretly fund his deeply toxic family would instantly become an active, heavily prioritized federal criminal investigation, complete with immediate arrest warrants and aggressive asset seizures. While Andre coldly and methodically finalized the brutal legal logistics of our impending massive retaliation, the composed, heavy silence in the background suddenly broke. I heard a sharp, desperate sob physically tear through the encrypted phone line. Lily could no longer contain her massive, overwhelming terror for my physical safety and my severe medical vulnerability. Her voice cracked wildly as she practically ripped the phone away from her husband's steady grip. She tearfully, desperately begged me to let them drive over to my house right this exact second. She aggressively promised they would completely shatter the heavy custom front door violently, storm past my sleeping husband, and physically carry my bleeding, feverishly shaking body out of that freezing, damp concrete basement. She desperately pleaded with me to completely abandon the toxic house and let the massive legal fallout happen from a safe distance. My heart ached painfully at her fierce protective love, but my internal resolve remained absolutely solid, forged entirely from cold, hard ice and intense fury. I forced my raw, dry throat to swallow the burning pain and whispered my refusal with absolute unshakable finality. I explicitly told Lily that if I allowed them to rescue me in the middle of the night, Richard and Patricia would instantly control and aggressively spin the narrative. They would confidently tell the responding police officers and the arriving paramedics that I was simply a hysterical, deeply unstable wife, suffering from severe surgical complications, who randomly fled her own loving home in a paranoid delusion. I absolutely refused to let them paint me as a crazy victim. I firmly declared that I was staying exactly where I was. I was going to force them to completely face the massive consequences of their own cruel actions right inside the very walls they were actively trying to steal. A heavy, deeply respectful silence fell over the phone line. Lily entirely understood the absolute unyielding steel in my raspy voice and slowly handed the receiver back to her husband without another argument. Andre did not attempt to debate my highly dangerous tactical decision. He simply accepted my strict, uncompromising boundary and immediately shifted his focus toward the physical occupation of my valuable property. If I was absolutely determined to fiercely hold my ground in the dark, freezing basement, he was going to aggressively clear the entire battlefield currently playing out directly above my head. Andre firmly announced that he was immediately booting up his highly secure legal software to begin rapidly drafting heavily aggressive, completely unassailable formal eviction notices. Because my beautiful custom-built home was fully legally owned by my corporate LLC and explicitly managed entirely by the impenetrable blind trust, standard domestic residency laws and standard tenant protections absolutely did not apply to Richard's visiting family members. They were not legally protected tenants, nor were they considered standard house guests under the strict eyes of commercial property law. From a highly strict, heavily enforceable legal standpoint, Patricia George Rachel and her destructive children were officially classified as hostile corporate trespassers, illegally occupying a massive commercial asset without formal executive authorization. Andre confidently stated that these formal legally binding documents would be heavily finalized, officially stamped, and strictly prepared for immediate aggressive delivery by a specialized, heavily armed private process server the exact moment the sun came up. We were not going to politely ask his parasitic family to pack their bags. We were going to legally annihilate their false sense of absolute security and forcefully rip them out of my house before they could even finish breakfast. The next 72 hours became an extreme, grueling exercise in absolute psychological endurance. Andre strictly advised me that in order to fully cement the massive federal wire fraud charges, we had to let the bank complete their internal processing timeline, which meant enduring days 4, 5, and 6 of my agonizing captivity. I remained confined to the freezing, damp concrete basement, meticulously perfecting my highly calculated performance as the completely defeated, physically broken wife. I weaponized my own genuine surgical trauma, deliberately exaggerating my extreme weakness whenever Richard or his deeply toxic mother bothered to briefly descend the wooden stairs. I stopped asking for basic medical supplies. I stopped begging for proper food. I simply lay on the cheap guest mattress staring blankly at the cinder block wall with hollow, defeated eyes. Every time the basement door creaked open, I physically recoiled, projecting total fear. When Patricia tossed a single slice of dry toast onto my mattress, I did not protest. I slowly ate it in complete silence, projecting total subservience. This flawless, highly disciplined performance provided them with an absolute, undeniable false sense of total victory, actively feeding the massive delusion that my financial assets were theirs for the taking. I carefully monitored my shallow breathing to protect my healing incisions, using the endless hours of dark isolation to mentally rehearse every single step of the impending retaliation. I was no longer a victim. I was a highly lethal predator patiently waiting in the dark shadows of my own home. Directly above my head, Richard's arrogant confidence mutated into an incredibly reckless, insufferable display of unearned dominance. Heavily intoxicated by the absolute certainty of his impending $300,000 windfall, he began throwing his weight around my beautiful house like a tyrannical king who had just successfully conquered a massive new territory. He loudly dismissed my regular housekeeper when she arrived for her scheduled weekly cleaning, rudely claiming that my house was now permanently under his exclusive family management. He actively encouraged his sister and his mother to completely disregard my expensive furnishings. Through the hidden security cameras, I watched my greedy husband confidently pull out his high-interest personal credit cards to aggressively finance their luxurious stolen lifestyle. He ordered massive, highly expensive catered meals from the most exclusive downtown restaurants, happily feeding his parasitic family premium steaks and imported seafood on plates I had personally purchased in Italy. He confidently racked up thousands of dollars in new high-interest debt, absolutely certain that my stolen home equity would effortlessly clear his accounts by the end of the week. He strutted through my custom kitchen, loudly bragging to George about his brilliant financial investments and his supposed genius business maneuvers. Richard genuinely believed he had successfully outsmarted a highly successful chief executive officer, completely unaware that his reckless, massive spending spree was actively tightening the federal noose directly around his own arrogant neck. He completely ignored his mounting credit card balances, foolishly believing the massive upcoming cash injection would easily erase all of his remarkably reckless financial decisions. While my husband aggressively celebrated his imaginary wealth, I quietly endured the relentless, agonizing chaos of his deeply malicious family. I listened to the heavy, destructive footsteps of Rachel's feral children as they actively used my expensive hardwood floors as a chaotic indoor playground. I tolerated Patricia's cruel daily sneers whenever she briefly opened the basement door to throw down a cheap bottle of tap water or loudly mock my pathetic physical state. She constantly reminded me that I was entirely useless, heavily implying that my prolonged medical recovery was just a manipulative, lazy excuse to avoid my wifely duties. I absorbed every single cruel insult in total silence, using their vicious arrogance as absolute fuel for my burning internal rage. Beneath the thin blanket on my damp mattress, my trembling fingers were constantly moving across my smartphone screen. I maintained a highly secure, encrypted text dialogue with Andre throughout the entire grueling week. While Patricia mocked my silence, Andre was actively confirming the absolute success of our massive legal trap. He sent me highly confidential screenshots, proving that the massive corporate compliance alert had officially been registered with the banking institution. The federal fraud flag was permanently locked into the central banking mainframe. Furthermore, Andre had officially briefed the local police precinct commander regarding the highly volatile imminent corporate eviction, ensuring that heavily armed law enforcement would be fully prepared to rapidly intervene the exact moment the massive federal trap snapped completely shut. By the time the sun finally rose on Friday morning, the intricate, highly explosive stage was perfectly set. The entire house was vibrating with their greedy, deeply toxic anticipation. Richard was practically buzzing with arrogant energy, constantly checking the banking application on his smartphone, eagerly waiting for the massive, fraudulent loan to officially clear into his private offshore account. Patricia was busy packing her bags confidently, preparing to permanently install Rachel into my beautiful custom master bedroom the second the brutal divorce papers were aggressively served. They thought this was the glorious, victorious culmination of their brilliant master plan. They had absolutely no idea that every single move they made had been heavily monitored, legally documented, and aggressively countered by a massive corporate legal team. The heavy, agonizing wait was finally over. The brutal, unforgiving trap was entirely armed and heavily loaded with federal felony charges, massive corporate trespassing violations, and a highly aggressive tactical police response. I slowly pushed my battered, healing body off the damp basement mattress. I ignored the sharp residual pain radiating from my sliced abdomen and firmly planted my bare feet onto the freezing concrete floor. I had spent 6 agonizing days playing the pathetic, broken victim in the dark. Now it was time to ascend the wooden stairs and aggressively reclaim my stolen corporate kingdom. I waited patiently in the quiet shadows, listening to their arrogant laughter echo through the floorboards. I was perfectly prepared to spring the massive trap the exact moment Friday evening finally arrived. Friday evening finally descended upon the property, bringing with it the absolute climax of their incredible delusion. While I stood perfectly still in the freezing shadows of the basement staircase, the main floor directly above me erupted into a massive, highly orchestrated social event. Patricia had spent the entire afternoon aggressively directing Rachel and the feral children to meticulously clean the main living areas, actively preparing to host a lavish dinner party. But this was not just a simple private celebration for their toxic extended family. Patricia had aggressively crossed a massive social boundary by actively inviting several of my highly affluent, deeply private neighbors from the gated community. Through the hidden audio feed on my smartphone, I listened as my wealthy neighbors arrived, their voices laced with polite confusion as they were aggressively ushered into my custom marble foyer by a woman they had never met. Patricia was entirely in her element, loudly playing the gracious, incredibly wealthy hostess. She paraded my confused neighbors through the expensive architectural features of my home, aggressively showing off the custom chef's kitchen, the imported Italian tile, and the massive vaulted ceilings, as if she had personally designed and entirely financed every single inch. She was aggressively claiming my territory right in front of my own social circle, completely oblivious to the massive federal trap that was currently locking tightly shut around her son. She served my expensive imported cheeses on my custom silver platters, commanding the crowded room with absolute unearned authority. The true depths of Patricia's absolute malice became violently clear when my closest neighbor, a prominent local surgeon named Dr. Evans, politely inquired about my sudden, highly uncharacteristic absence from my own home. I gripped the wooden railing of the basement stairs as Patricia immediately launched into a heavily rehearsed, entirely fabricated narrative designed to permanently destroy my social and professional reputation. She lowered her voice into a sickeningly fake tone of deep maternal sorrow. She aggressively lied directly to Dr. Evans, heavily claiming that my recent complex surgical procedure had triggered a massive, highly dangerous psychological breakdown. She spun a complex, terrifying web of absolute deceit, telling the horrified wealthy crowd that I was currently suffering from severe mental health issues and extreme emotional instability. She confidently stated that I was actively refusing all standard medical treatment and acting violently toward my loving, deeply devoted husband. To perfectly seal her disgusting narrative, she told the neighbors that Richard was tragically being forced to permanently move me out of the house and into a highly secure psychiatric facility by the very end of the weekend. She painted herself as the heroic, self-sacrificing mother who had dropped absolutely everything to rush into town and aggressively manage the failing estate, while her deeply traumatized son dealt with his crazy broken wife. She was actively setting the social stage for my permanent forced eviction, ensuring my wealthy peers would simply pity Richard. By 8 o'clock, the massive custom living room was absolutely packed to total capacity. At least 15 toxic relatives and several highly uncomfortable neighbors were crowded tightly around the glowing modern fireplace. The overwhelming noise of their overlapping conversations, the aggressive clinking of my expensive crystal, and the loud, chaotic shouting of Rachel's undisciplined children completely filled the entire house. Richard had confidently opened 3 massive bottles of my highly exclusive imported vintage champagne, aggressively pouring generous glasses for absolutely everyone in the room. He was practically vibrating with immense, arrogant euphoria. The clock had finally struck the precise hour he firmly believed the $300,000 fraudulent loan had successfully cleared directly into his private offshore account. He genuinely thought he was now a massively wealthy, highly successful man who had flawlessly executed the perfect domestic crime. He confidently stepped right into the exact center of the marble floor, actively demanding the spotlight. He aggressively tapped a heavy silver spoon against his expensive crystal champagne flute. The sharp, high-pitched ringing sound immediately cut through the heavy party noise, demanding absolute attention from the crowded room. Richard smiled broadly, looking directly at his deeply proud mother and his greedy sister. He raised his expensive glass high into the warm air, loudly clearing his throat, to aggressively propose a massive celebratory toast to their highly lucrative new beginnings. He never got the chance to finish his arrogant stolen speech. Before the very first word of his toxic toast could escape his mouth, I firmly grabbed the heavy brass handle of the basement door. I did not simply open it. I aggressively shoved the heavy wooden door completely backward on its metal hinges. The loud, violent crack of the wood hitting the drywall echoed like a massive gunshot over the crowded living room. The lively party noise died instantly. The entire room fell into an absolute, terrifyingly dead silence. Every single head aggressively snapped toward the dark hallway. I slowly stepped out of the heavy shadows and walked directly into the bright, warm light of the main floor. I was no longer the shivering, bleeding victim they had confidently locked away. I was standing completely upright, forcefully ignoring the sharp, burning pain in my sliced abdomen. I wore a perfectly tailored, highly expensive dark silk suit that screamed absolute corporate authority. My hair was sharply pulled back and my eyes were completely deadlocked directly onto Richard's suddenly terrified face. The entire atmosphere of the room violently transformed in a single microsecond, instantly shifting from a warm, arrogant celebration into a freezing, highly dangerous hostage situation. The confused neighbors stared in absolute shock at the perfectly lucid, sharply dressed woman they were just told was completely insane. The champagne glasses froze entirely in midair. The true owner had officially entered the room. The shocked silence hanging in my living room was so absolute you could hear the soft crackling of the fireplace logs. I stepped fully out of the hallway shadows, allowing the bright recessed lighting to completely illuminate my physical transformation. I was no longer the pathetic, shivering woman wrapped in dirty pajamas. I had used the last hour of my dark isolation to meticulously strip away every single trace of the victim they had eagerly tried to create. Instead, I was wearing a sharply tailored, heavily structured crimson suit. The deep blood-red fabric draped flawlessly over my shoulders, projecting an overwhelming aura of absolute corporate authority. It was the exact same suit I wore to highly contentious corporate acquisitions. Every single step I took toward the center of the room required a monumental effort of physical endurance. Searing, jagged spikes of burning agony ripped through my fresh surgical incisions with every slight movement of my hips, a vicious reminder of my vulnerabilities. My abdominal muscles screamed in protest, desperately begging me to collapse. I aggressively refused. I forced my spine into straight, rigid alignment, projecting an impeccable, towering posture that completely betrayed the heavy medical trauma hiding beneath the expensive red silk. My hair was pulled back into a severe twist, and my makeup was sharply applied to hide the lingering fever. I looked directly at the affluent neighbors who had just been forcefully fed a fabricated narrative about my severe mental breakdown. Dr. Evans stared at me with wide, intelligent eyes, instantly recognizing the sharply dressed executive standing confidently before him was absolutely not a heavily traumatized psychiatric patient. The undeniable visual contrast shattered their entire toxic illusion in seconds. Patricia was the first person to successfully break the paralyzing shock holding the room hostage. She aggressively slammed her expensive crystal champagne glass down onto my custom marble coffee table, her sharp features contorting into an ugly mask of absolute fury and frantic panic. She realized her perfectly constructed social narrative was rapidly collapsing directly in front of my wealthy peers. She desperately attempted to rapidly regain control and firmly reestablish her unearned dominance. She let out a loud, highly exaggerated scoff, completely dripping with fake maternal condescension. She pointed her manicured finger directly at my face, acting as if I were a deeply disobedient child. She loudly ordered me to immediately turn around and march directly back down into the dark basement. She told the uncomfortable neighbors my sudden appearance was exactly the kind of erratic, dangerous behavior she had warned them about. She claimed I was in the middle of a severe episode and desperately needed to be medicated and isolated for my own safety. She demanded Richard step forward immediately and physically remove me from the living room. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue with her insane accusations. I did not even bother to look in her direction. I simply locked my dead, icy gaze directly onto Richard's pale face and slowly smiled. It was a terrifying, deeply malicious, highly calculated smile of absolute destruction. That single silent expression of pure menace completely unnerved the entire room. The greedy family members slowly began backing away from the fireplace, finally recognizing the absolute danger radiating from my rigid posture. At the peak of that suffocating tension, the sharp, highly aggressive chime of the front doorbell violently pierced the silence. It was a loud, forceful, highly demanding strike that practically vibrated through the expensive hardwood floors. Richard jumped out of his skin, his eyes darting frantically toward the front entryway. He aggressively ordered his sister to go see who was pounding on the door. I did not wait for Rachel to move. I calmly raised my left hand, displaying my secure smartphone to the entire silent room. I tapped the main security application on my glowing screen, remotely unlocking the heavy electronic deadbolt, securing the custom front door. The loud mechanical click echoed sharply down the long marble foyer. The heavy wooden door aggressively swung open, letting a blast of cold evening air rush directly into the stifling living room. Lily marched fiercely into the house, her eyes blazing with protective fury as she instantly locked onto my standing figure. Right behind her stepped Andre. He completely filled the wide doorway, his massive presence instantly dominating the space. He was dressed in a highly intimidating, perfectly tailored dark navy suit, radiating the absolute cold efficiency of a corporate executioner. Clutched firmly in his large right hand was a thick, heavy black leather briefcase that contained the legally binding ruin of my husband's entire parasitic family. Two fully uniformed local police officers confidently crossed the threshold and stepped onto my marble foyer, right behind Andre, magnifying his sheer intimidation factor. Their heavy boots echoed loudly as they officially entered the highly volatile scene. The soft ambient jazz music playing through the hidden ceiling speakers was abruptly silenced as Lily aggressively slammed her hand against the master control panel on the hallway wall. The sudden total absence of background noise made the heavy breathing in the room sound incredibly loud. The festive, arrogant atmosphere of the stolen dinner party permanently died on the spot. The two police officers placed their hands calmly but firmly on their heavy utility belts, their sharp, observant eyes quickly scanning the crowded, deeply confused room before firmly locking directly onto Richard. They were not here to politely break up a neighborhood noise complaint. They were fully briefed, heavily authorized tactical backup for a massive corporate eviction and a highly severe federal felony investigation. The incredibly smug, deeply arrogant smile Richard had been wearing for the last 6 agonizing days completely vanished from his face in a single, terrifying instant. The expensive crystal champagne flute violently trembled in his suddenly weak, shaking hand. He stared in absolute, unblinking horror at the heavy leather briefcase and the gleaming silver badges blocking his only possible exit. The trap had officially, irrevocably sprung shut. The heavy crystal champagne flute slipped from Richard's trembling fingers, shattering violently against the expensive hardwood floor. The sharp crash of breaking glass snapped the paralyzed room back to a terrifying reality. Richard's face, previously flushed with arrogant triumph, instantly drained of all color, leaving behind a sickly, terrifying pale white. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing frantically as he desperately tried to regain his stolen composure. He aggressively puffed out his chest, attempting to project a false sense of masculine authority to the heavily armed officers blocking his only exit. He stepped cautiously toward the police, his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of completely fabricated innocence. He stammered frantically, heavily insisting to the stern officers that there was a massive, unfortunate misunderstanding. He forced a sick, trembling laugh, claiming this was simply a private domestic dispute that had tragically escalated out of control due to his wife's severe psychological deterioration. He aggressively pointed a shaking finger at my sharply dressed figure, heavily telling the police they needed to immediately escort me directly to a psychiatric hospital. He loudly proclaimed that he was the rightful man of the house, the primary financial breadwinner, and the absolute legal owner of this massive estate. He aggressively demanded the officers immediately remove Andre and Lily from his private property, aggressively citing his completely fabricated rights as the master of the home. The officers did not flinch, nor did they acknowledge his pathetic, desperate commands. They remained absolutely still, their hands resting firmly on their heavy utility belts, waiting for the designated corporate counsel to officially execute the aggressive legal strike. Richard's voice grew increasingly shrill and panicked as his desperate, Frantic lies completely failed to move the towering authorities standing entirely unbothered in my beautiful marble foyer. As the highly incriminating audio recording completely faded into the heavy, shocked silence of the living room, the two fully uniformed police officers immediately broke their rigid, observant stances. The taller of the two officers stepped forward with absolute, undeniable authority, his heavy black boots thudding aggressively against the custom hardwood floor. He unclipped the heavy metal handcuffs from his tactical utility belt. The sharp, mechanical jingle of the metal restraints violently cut through the suffocating tension. He looked directly at my fiercely trembling husband and loudly, forcefully instructed Richard to immediately turn around and place both of his hands firmly behind his back. The direct, unyielding police command finally shattered the last remaining fragile piece of Richard's massive, arrogant delusion. Absolute, unadulterated panic completely consumed him. His knees physically buckled under the immense weight of his total federal destruction, causing him to stumble awkwardly against the expensive marble coffee table. He threw his shaking hands up in the air violently, shaking his head in absolute pathetic denial. He began frantically backing away from the advancing officers, completely ignoring their heavy, aggressive warnings to immediately comply. When he finally realized there was absolutely no physical escape, he desperately threw himself toward my perfectly tailored crimson suit. He fell completely to his knees right in front of me, his arrogant pride entirely obliterated. Tears of absolute terror streamed rapidly down his pale, sickly face. He reached out with wildly shaking hands, desperately trying to grab the expensive fabric of my trousers. He loudly, pathetically begged me to immediately stop the police. He frantically pleaded that this was all just a massive, terrible mistake, aggressively sobbing that every single illegal, deeply malicious action he took was simply done for the survival and financial betterment of his loving family. The harrowing saga of Clara's incredible survival and ultimate retaliation against her treacherous husband Richard illuminates a profound and often difficult truth. Family is strictly defined by unwavering loyalty and protective action, not by biological ties or legal marriage certificates. Society frequently romanticizes the concept of blood relation, pressuring individuals to silently tolerate toxic, parasitic behavior under the false guise of familial obligation. Clara's terrifying ordeal within the walls of her own home completely dismantles this highly dangerous misconception. When Richard, the man who explicitly vowed to cherish her, callously discarded her in a freezing basement during a severely vulnerable medical recovery to steal her corporate assets, the absolute fragility of their legally binding bond was violently exposed. Furthermore, his relatives eagerly participated in her abuse, proving beyond a doubt that bloodlines can harbor the most vicious opportunists. Conversely, Clara's genuine family emerged not from a sense of assumed entitlement, but through decisive, fiercely protective actions. Her sister Lily and brother-in-law Andre did not hesitate to aggressively step into a highly volatile battlefield. They provided the brilliant legal strategy, the unshakable emotional anchor, and the physical presence necessary to orchestrate a flawless defense. They demonstrated that true love requires actively confronting the darkness and refusing to let those you care about face total annihilation alone. This narrative serves as a stark, empowering reminder that we possess the absolute authority to curate our own inner circles. We are never obligated to offer sanctuary or grace to those who actively scheme to dismantle our hard-earned peace, regardless of their formal titles. True allegiance is consistently earned through respect and decisive action, never mandated by a mere shared last name. Evaluate your own inner circle carefully today, and forcefully evict anyone who attempts to compromise your mental and permanent physical sanctuary.